And we're live.
So that means we need to keep quiet.
Yeah, absolute silence at this point.
Total silence.
This is how we behave in church.
Yeah.
All right, so here we go. Everybody is coming in now. We have our participant count. I can actually see the number clocking up right now. So I'll just give it one moment as everybody joins. But yes, good evening, everyone. My name is John Tapes. I'm the event coordinator at McNally Robinson Booksellers here in Winnipeg. This event is being broadcast from Winnipeg and thusly is being broadcast from Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, the homeland of the Métis Nation. We're so pleased to have you all here with us tonight, virtually, to celebrate the launch of Andrew Unger's debut novel, Once Removed. Those familiar with Andrew's work on the Daily Bonnet will not be surprised by how funny this book is, but it's also, as David Bergen mentions, an incredibly joyful novel, rich in emotion and beautifully written. You'll only have to put up with me for just a short while as I introduce tonight's host, but what I will encourage you all to do while this event is taking place is to feel free to ask questions. There's a Q&A button, which you'll notice just at the bottom of your screen. You can also join our chat if you want to say hello to folks as well, so please do feel free to reach out. During the Q&A period, Nathan will be reading some of the questions that you sent through. But your host for the evening is Nathan Dueck. His middle name is Russell, which means his initials spell nerd. His parents tell him that nobody used that word when he was born, but dictionaries say otherwise. Turnstone Press published his first book of poetry, Kingsmere, some 16 years ago. In it, he rewrote the biography of Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King by shifting the focus from politics to the occult. 11 years later, he published Hill, his second book of poetry, with Peddler Press. It's the only book about Mennonites from southern Manitoba from the last decade that wasn't a bestseller. Last year, he published a third book of poetry, a very special episode, with Buckrider Books. He was also honored to write the afterword to the Turnstone Selects republication of Armin Weeb's The Salvation of Yash Siemens, a book that he's requested in his will to be buried with. So, to kick off this evening and introduce Andrew Unger, please put your virtual hands together for Nathan Dueck.
Thank you so much, John. That's very kind of you. Good day. Good day, friends and Frenschaft. Vashinet. Welcome to the family gathering. I see you brought potato salad. Just put that over there on the picnic table with the other potato salads. Spring your lawn chair and pull up a circle over here. The zote bag will be around in no time. Yerba? Okay, just more for me. I'm broadcasting tonight from the traditional unceded territory of the Ktunaxa and Kinbasket peoples. There are 5 First Nation bands located on the regional boundary of what we call the East Kootenays. I'm specifically sitting in Cranbrook, BC. 4 bands are Ktunaxa and 1 is Shuswap, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to both learn and live in this territory, which is known as Ktunaxa. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Andrew, and it's going to get a little bit nosy, so beware. It wouldn't feel appropriately Mennonite, though, if I didn't insinuate myself right into someone else's business, though, I feel. Andrew Unger is best known as a satirist. The fact that he's found a way to be known at all is an achievement. He's the man behind, or maybe under, the Daily Bonnet, which is a satirical news website which he founded in the year of our Lord, 2016. And I wasn't kidding about Andrew being well known. Yesterday, when he posted Winkler adopts new, more appropriate slogan, Oboyo Wankler, friends from town sent it to me via email about a dozen times. I every time graciously accepted it as though I hadn't seen it before, but let's move on. Andrew is a writer, he is a public speaker, and an educator. He holds degrees from the University of Manitoba, and he's taught English language arts at Steinbach Regional Secondary School for more than 15 years. And now Andrew's work has appeared, as we mentioned previously, in the Daily Bonnet, and that's probably how you know him. But he's also published in G's, in Rhubarb, Ballast, Preservings, CBC.ca, and the Winnipeg Free Press, as well as the Friends Journal, among many others. Now, his website claims that if you go back far enough, he's probably related to you. But I'm not sure that's true. Does anybody want to watch us go through the Mennonite game? Because let's do this Menno style, by committee vote. No one is making eye contact with me, so we're just going to move on. Once Removed is Andrew's first novel, and if you want to read more novels by him, buy this one. Do it now. I'll wait. It looks great on the shelf next to your large print family Bible. You can impress your friends and neighbors. And if you have any questions for Andrew, as John mentioned earlier, he's reading, and while he's reading, something may pop into mind. Please type it into the chat. I'll be watching the chat, monitoring the Q&A, because I'm going to be posing those questions to Andrew a little later on, and you're probably going to have better questions for him than I do. So it's launch time, and I know it's not what you're thinking. He's going to read a book. We're not eating plots. Put your hands together for Andrew, everyone.
I can hear my wife clapping in the other room. That's the one. Yeah, I'd just like to thank Nathan, John, McNally Robinson for organizing this, Turnstone Press. I'm really excited to present my book. You know, someone, I'll read in just a second. Is that the first thing I'm supposed to do is read?
This is your night.
Oh, okay.
Do with it what you want. If you just want to sit there and cry and make us watch you do it, we're cool.
You could just sit and watch me eat zote for 45 minutes.
You got your Ronnie's Jumbos ready.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, someone said that, and more than one person has said that you and I, me and Nathan, look identical. And I thought, you know, before I saw Nathan on Zoom here, I thought, well, I grew a beard just so that Nathan and I wouldn't look the same. And then you grew a beard. I'm like, what are we going to do? In fact, you know what? It's so bad that someone said that, hey, look at that. They put Nate, you know, on the Facebook event page. Someone said, look, they put Nathan's photo on the Facebook event page. And I'm like, no, that's me. Not Nathan. But we are probably.
This beard, by the way, is called my quarantine beard or my Corin beard. And I nicknamed it Rudy. So that's Rudy, everyone.
Rudy Weeb.
You betcha.
Okay, good. All right. Okay, so I'll read a little bit here from my book. So this is from the very beginning of the book, and it kind of establishes some of the, you know, what the book is about, stuff like that. So I'll read the first few pages here. They cut down 20 trees by the co-op this week, elms. They claimed they were diseased and marked each one with a red dot just hours before the Thiessen boys came with their chainsaws. The whole time I sat there in the truck with the engine idling and the radio tuned to the funeral announcements, waiting for Mr. Vogt to pound on the hood a couple of times and say, "Nah, Timothy, it looks like you're good to go." Then I hauled it all off to the dump to be burned. It wasn't a pleasant scene, all those trees coming down and the barren land left there afterwards, but it did have some reason to be optimistic. The last time a whole row of trees went down like this, there was a liquor store on the cleared lot within months. It's our first one, and rumor has it, the busiest in rural Manitoba. Now we don't have to sneak off to St. Adele for booze. We can get our wine in a box right here in Edenfeld. Another patch of elms was declared diseased to make way for a dollar store. Progress is progress. Katie and I have a beautiful mature tree in our backyard too, but thankfully it's behind the house and therefore in an undesirable location for commercial enterprise. I worry about those tall ones on Wilshire though. They're oaks, remnants of a large stand that predates European settlement in this area. There's a plaque nearby stating as much, which appears to have protected them from the ambitions of local land developers and or mayors who also happen to be land developers. I asked Mr. Vogt about the land by the co-op if he knew what was happening to it, but all he said was mayor's orders and he left the rest to my imagination. I'm not sure that was a good idea because I can envision some pretty awful things cropping up on that lot, probably another donut shop with inadequate drive-through space. Mr. Vogt says it's better not to ask too many questions. Edenfeld prides itself on our aggressive disease prevention program, which requires the swift removal of trees that are past their prime and buildings that, in Mr. Vogt's words, attract vermin if left to their own devices. These are the very same trees and buildings that other towns might try to preserve for environmental or historical reasons. According to the sign on the highway, Edenfeld was founded in 1876, but good luck finding anything older than about 1990. There are some exceptions, of course, but the Parks and Rec Department is rapidly making them a thing of the past. Once things seemed under control at the co-op, Mr. Vogt tasked me with picking the dandelions at BLT Wiens Memorial Park. BLT Wiens is actually still alive and still our mayor, but the town figured it'd be more economical to include the word memorial right away rather than waiting to add it in later. I was told to pick the weeds by hand, and with the 3 Teesons busy felling the last of the trees, the job was mine alone. Chemical herbicides are banned in our province, a recent law that greatly upset Edenfeld politicians who feel that weeding is a strictly civic matter. BLT explained all this in an angry memo that for some reason also specified we couldn't even use citrus juice to kill the weeds. But I think that had less to do with the environmental impact and more to do with maintaining our thriving local potluck scene, which has always relied on an ample supply of lemon meringue pie among other varieties. The new weeding process is much more labor intensive, such that the mayor's eponymous park is the only one in town that receives this level of attention. Mr. Vogt said I should bring my chainsaw. And not for the dandelions, of course, he clarified, but if you see an elm that looks iffy, go for it. He always speaks a little louder than necessary, which makes him a suitable candidate to run a demolition crew, but not someone to chat with for prolonged periods in the church lobby. I didn't get all the dandelions picked, but by the end of the day, the workday, I had more than enough to fill a pail for Mr. Harder. I was supposed to meet him after work at Ernie's Diner above the gas station. I figured I could spare a pail of dandelions since Mr. Harder's winemaking supply is always running low and he's one of my favorite clients. I've been working on his family history book for a while now. Katie and I are hoping that eventually I can transition to writing full time, but at the moment, the Parks and Rec job pays the bills. My friend Randall says my life is fraught with cognitive dissonance. He admits his is too, only for reasons that he never fully articulates, which I assume have something to do with the fact that he's unmarried and well into his 30s, and the pressure is on from his mother to do something about that situation. I'm a ghostwriter, or trying to be anyways. This means I write books for other people. So does Randall. We're guns for hire, so to speak, though around here, gun analogies are generally frowned upon. As much as I prefer to spend my days preserving the memories of Edenfeld's senior citizens rather than demolishing heritage buildings to create space for yet another strip mall, I simply can't afford that luxury. I have a mortgage to pay and a wife who's finishing her master's in contemporary philosophy, and there isn't enough ghostwriting work to keep both Randall and me employed full time. Not yet, Katie always says. Mr. Harder is into trees too. There's one right outside the manor where he lives that is said to be a descendant of the great oak of Kortica. It was planted by Edenfeld's pioneers using seeds they brought from the old country. Sometimes, when the weather's nice, we sit on the porch swing of the manor and he never fails to point it out and say, "That tree over there, Timothy, is Frinshoft, or the famous great oak." He asked me to dedicate an entire chapter to the great oak of Kortica. I felt it was a bit much for only one tree, but he insisted. He traveled to Russia and Ukraine in the 90s on one of those Mennonite history tours where he took dozens of photos of the famous great oak, including at least a couple that weren't completely out of focus. He wants to include about 30 pages worth in his book. It'll be the most comprehensive visual documentation of the great oak ever put into print, he boasted. I assured him that even at 1 or 2 pages, he'd still have the record. When I went there, Mr. Harder said there weren't more than a handful of branches that still had green leaves on them. He showed me a snapshot that confirmed his assessment. "It looks dead," I observed. "Oh, it's not dead," he assured me, "just dying." I told him its prospects were about as good as any of the trees here in Edenfeld. He laughed. He gets me. I guess that's why he hired me to ghostwrite his latest book for him. It's tentatively titled The Harder Path, Problems and How We Overcame Them, from Wolochna to Southern Manitoba by Dietrich F. Harder. The book is the third in a series after Working Hard and Praying Harder, Life on the Farm, and a slim volume that documents his father's declining years called, Quite Frankly, It's Never Been Harder. Randall wrote that one. A large chunk of Mr. Harder's new book is based on the notes he took during that trip to Eastern Europe 25 years ago, only his recollection of the facts is rather suspect and his spelling is all over the place. However, checking facts and correcting spelling are just 2 of the many services a ghostwriter can provide. That's what Randall and I always tell clients anyways, to drum up business. Our mysterious ability to boot up a computer also seemed to impress the locals, and we're some of the only people around here reasonably proficient with a word processor. This is a great embarrassment for the mayor, who considers himself a real progressive. For a while, he even offered a course at the library called Computer Usage for Mennonites and Other Beginners. But only 6 people signed up, and most of them were just in it for the free cheese curds and rolled up slices of processed ham the town provided for attendees. The event wasn't entirely useless. BLT used a photo of his students peering with bewilderment into their computer monitors for one of his campaign mailers. I enjoy working with Mr. Harder, but it can be confusing at times. Over the centuries, the Harders lived in 3 different countries and 3 successive villages, each called Edenfeld. a name that refers to the Garden of Eden and one that's more blindly optimistic than accurate. Given the large number of villages Mennonites have christened with that name, I often have to clarify, you mean Edenfeld, Russia, not Edenfeld, Canada, right? And Mr. Harder isn't always sure. So sometimes we look at the photos and guess based on what people are wearing or how much snow has accumulated in front of the houses. But even then, it isn't always conclusive. There were Edenfelds all over the place in the old country, each one of them abandoned a long time ago. There used to be more than one here too. There was another Edenfeld on the other side of the river that was labeled on old maps as Lower Edenfeld, probably because it was a few miles closer to the American border. The whole town escaped to Paraguay long ago, where they hacked out rich farmland from dense jungle. Our Edenfeld is closer to the city, which means on weekends, we escape to the mall and hack our way through dense crowds to get deals on yoga pants. So that's kind of the first section there. I'm going to read another, because this is a book launch, although not how I had envisioned it, originally. Slow down, please. Okay, sorry, I'll slow down. Later on in the book, there's actually like two scenes in the book that involve book launches. So I figured I would have to read at least one of those here. So in the beginning, that first part that I read is kind of establishes that he's a ghostwriter and he wrote this book for Mr. Harder, but Mr. Harder fires him. That's not really a spoiler. It happens pretty early on, and writes the book himself. So I'll just read that section later on in the book at Mr. Harder's book launch. I'll just read, these sections are shorter than that first one there. So Mrs. Entz told me she'd seen him, that's referring to Mr. Harder, struggling to operate the personal computer printers at the library. Get ready, she said, I think he's about to launch. Sure enough, within a few days, there were posters all over town displaying the cover his grandson Elmer had designed. A black and white photograph of Mr. Harder as a child on the farm, tilted sideways and bordered like a postage stamp. In large capital letters, the poster read, The Harder They Fall, a book by Dietrich F. Harder. He had changed the title. There was no mention of my name. I saw from the posters that the book launch was at 5 p.m, just after my leaf blowing shift with Parks and Rec. Exactly the time Mr. Harder and I used to meet at Ernie's. I thought it was rather considerate of him to schedule it at such a time when I would be able to attend, and I wondered if that was intentional. Maybe it was an olive branch of sorts. If it was his way of reaching out, then I decided I'd reciprocate and show up. My intentions weren't entirely reconciliatory, however, as the check he had given me had not, in fact, covered all my expenses, and he still owed me a bit of cash. When I arrived at Ernie's, I saw that they hadn't finished setting up all the chairs. I offered to help, but Ernie said the arrangement of chairs required special training. Timothy, stand over there with your wife yet, he said. I replied, okay, sure, sounds good. But Katie had stayed home to work on her thesis. I don't ask her to come to things like this. I stood against the back wall and watched Ernie's specially trained individuals set up chairs and flirt. I wondered whether flirting was part of the training or just an added benefit of the job. There was tape on the floor that indicated where the chairs should go, and I thought that Ernie had vastly overestimated the difficulty of the task. Mr. Harder was there in the front row next to his wife, Justina, who was offering him a whole host of useful items, like moist towelettes and soda crackers from deep inside her purse. I figured I'd wait until this whole thing was over to ask for my money. At exactly 5:15, Ernie went to the front and introduced Mr. Harder to the audience, recounting how they'd known each other since their time in the one-room schoolhouse in Hostad, and how excited he was to see this newest Harder story finally brought to life. 17 people had showed up, and that include me, Mr. Harder, Justina, and all 6 members of the setup crew. City Sheila was there too, hawking her mascara. So it was a pretty good turnout. I wasn't sure how he was ever going to sell all the copies he printed, even accounting for each of his grandchildren getting one at Christmas and maybe another one as a birthday gift or to pass along to a friend. There wasn't much in the way of festivities, no reading, not even a prayer of blessing meant to encourage book sales. Could we do that later? I glanced about the room, looked at each and every person. Oh, sorry, I'm just going to skip ahead here a little bit. After everyone else had left, Mr. Taves, another former client, and Mr. Harder stood by the table of unsold books and spoke for a while in Plautdietsch, interspersed with some English and a few words in regular German that we don't have in our version of the language. I took it from the tone, volume, and speed of their discussion that they were both quite happy with the book launch. I didn't want to interrupt their lovely repartee, but it was fairly urgent that I get that last payment from Mr. Harder. I was apprehensive, though, because there was always the chance that Mr. Harder would say, "What last payment?" And then I wouldn't know whether he sincerely didn't remember or if he was just trying to save a few bucks. "Oh, Timothy, yes, Mr. Harder said. Thank you for coming. I didn't forget you. Sorry to keep you waiting." He reached into the metal box where he put all the money from his book sales. "And here you are," he said. "You're cut." I turned my back to him and counted the money. It was $36, most of it in rolls of It was $36, most of it in rolls of quarters. I looked at Mr. Harder. "This isn't how it works," I said. And should I read one more short section here? Okay. Now this is unrelated to those other sections, but the book is also, I would say, not just about preserving buildings and ghostwriting and stuff, but it's also about relationships. So this section recounts the first time that Timothy met his future wife, Katie, which was, well, you'll see when it was. The first time I saw Katie, I was on a wooden pew in wet swimming trunks as she was coming up out of the water. It was a singles event at South Edenfeld. I call it a singles event because that's how all the young people viewed it, though officially it was a baptismal class. The class was specifically designed for late bloomers like us who hadn't done it like you're supposed to during the summer between your high school graduation and your wedding day. Katie and I, however, were well into our 20s by then, so we got put in a class with the other heathens and people who had recently moved into town from the city. It's not that I didn't believe or didn't want to get baptized as a teenager, but in those days I hadn't yet found someone I wanted to marry and knew that as soon as I was baptized, the pressure would be on to get hitched to the nearest and most convenient young woman in brown nylons named Edna. Before they let you get baptized, they make you take classes where you learn about martyrs and the Sermon on the Mount and the true meaning of the ritual and why our particular baptismal method at our particular church is superior to the others. To longtime Edenfelders, this is old news, but to people like City Sheila, who was also in our class, there was quite the learning curve. There are so many nuances. We have a handful of Mennonite churches in town, but they agree on almost nothing, except that the Lutherans have got it all wrong with the whole baptizing babies thing. Right before your teenage wedding is much better. Unlike most of the churches around here, though, we're dunkers. We believe a baptism doesn't actually count unless you're soaking and shivering, clothes clinging to your body when you're finished. We get a lot of heat for this from the other churches who prefer to fill a plastic cup with tap water and slowly, solemnly pour it on the candidate's head. That day, I was sitting there in the sanctuary next to the baptismal tank, waiting my turn. I hit my head in the first practice dunk because I hadn't bent my knees the way I was supposed to, and Reverend Braisky said I could have another go at it once the others had a chance. Katie walked in 10 minutes after 7 o'clock, her chin up, confident, and Reverend Braisky said that since she had the audacity to show up late for practice, she must be well versed in the matter and may as well show the others how it's done. She went in and out like a synchronized swimmer, and when she was finished, the Reverend handed her a towel and commended her on her form and stamina, but suggested she should work on her backstroke. Katie smiled at me on her way out while I rubbed the back of my head and made a feeble attempt to return the gesture. On Sunday, wear comfortable, loose-fitting clothes, Reverend Braisky said, and absolutely no white. Like so many rules, Katie disregarded this one completely. When Sunday came, she wore ripped denim jeans and a blazing white Sonic Youth t-shirt. We started dating almost immediately after, before our clothes had even dried. We just confirmed everything the poorers ever thought about the evils of dunking, and even had some of the dunkers questioning their own doctrine too. All right.
Thanks for reading that piece. That piece that you just read was among my favorite in the novel. And I'm so curious what Sonic Youth album you had in mind that she was wearing.
Which one? There's a whole bunch. I don't. Maybe I didn't have a particular one in mind. I'll have to look there.
There's one that's titled Evil, EVOL. That's gotta be it. It is also white.
Is that a white one?
That's right.
Yeah, that might have been it.
The black image on the front.
Yeah,
Anyway.
that was probably it. Yeah.
Okay, so the passage you just read was about dunking before marriage. And where I'm from, I'm a Winklerite, so I'm kind of getting in under cover here because I know you Steinbackers don't like us that much. You call us names like Jan Cedars, but in Winkler we call that the catechism, and like you had to learn the catechism before you were going to become an official member of a church. And that idea we're going to now apply to a literary sense, because some of the questions that we've had coming up here had to do with your creative catechism. And so I'm going to ask 3 questions in quick succession that you can answer or deny answering at your will. First
Okay.
question is this, okay? Again, this is class, kids, so buckle up. This is a Bildungsroman, which is a nice German word, but it's a specific form of Bildungsroman. It's not just the development of a young person into adulthood, it's the development of an artist. So it's called a Künstlerroman. And so we've had 3 questions about this. Number 1, it's from Dr. Royden Lowen. Congratulations on your book. Looking forward to reading it, he says. He also calls you an original voice, so pat yourself on the back. But I suppose none of us write in a cultural or literary vacuum. How have your comedic southern Manitoba predecessors, Arnold Dick, Armin Wiebe, Miriam Toews, influenced you? What did you learn from them? But also, in what ways were you determined to establish your own voice?
Wow. Okay. They influenced me a lot. A lot. You know, I think I always had a sense of humor, and I was always kind of I don't know if sarcastic is the right word, but sort of a sarcastic individual even before I'd read any of those authors. But you know, like just the idea that you can write about your own cultural group, your own people, you know, that just that freedom to write about Mennonites, for example, and write about it in a funny way. You know, exactly, yeah. Arnold Dick, Armin Wiebe, Miriam Toews all did that long before I did, and I love all of their work. And in terms of like establishing my own voice, I don't think I ever consciously thought, you know, like this is the way Miriam writes, this is the way Armin writes, and how do I distinguish myself from that? I think, you know, that voice, or like the inklings, the seeds of that voice already kind of existed in me decades ago. Like I mentioned this and other things. I used to, when I was 12 years old, write Brian Mulrooney political cartoons. Like that's like not a normal 12-year-old thing to do, but that like satirical edge was already there. And I think when I started the Daily Bonnet, and then with this novel, I think I just then took that sort of sarcastic lens and applied it to what I was seeing and what I was observing. So
You use the word sarcasm, and
I'm using it imprecisely, I know.
No. I'm not trying to pick on you. I'm saying that there's some link between the description of sarcasm that you just provided and what we call satire. Like, you channeled it into satire, but satire isn't sarcasm. Sarcasm is to cut people down.
Right, you're right.
It's not meant to cause them to think. And so I'm going to skip ahead to another question by Dr. Magdalene Redekop. I'm only asking questions from people with PhDs, FYI.
Okay.
Magdalene Redekop asked, was it hard to move back and forth from the voice in the Daily Bonnet to the one that's in the novel? And did you feel any tension between the two while you were writing?
That's a good question. I didn't find it hard to move back and forth, because in the Daily Bonnet, I don't think of it so much as a voice. There's definitely a structure. You know, the articles all have this kind of structure, and I feel like on the Daily Bonnet there are many voices. You know, and so the voice in the novel, I think I was able to distinguish the two pretty. Like, I didn't find a lot of difficulty to go from one to the other, but at the same time, I wouldn't call. I'm not sure, you've read it. I don't know. Maybe you know. Technically speaking, whether Once Removed would fall into the category of satire or not. it has satirical elements in it, but it has other forms of humor in it too. I would call it, I put it in the category of mostly humor, comedy, but it's not exclusively satire or, the whole way through. So I think the fact that the Daily Bonnet has such a tight structure, organizational structure of the articles enabled me to kind of put that in its box, and this is its own thing. That alone, the structural difference, enabled that separation to come quite easy.
I think, having read the novel, I think the fact that you're writing from a first person perspective is helping, because the Daily Bonnet is written from some sort of distanced,
Yeah.
like kind of all knowing but not entirely all seeing, but it's also a persona, so you're actually kind of looking through your own mask, and you don't get that sense of a mask when you're reading the novel at all. And I think that's why the novel is appealing, and I want to thank you for writing it, because it's the first novel I was able to sit through and actually read since the pandemic started. So
Oh,
it,
wow.
it felt like home, and I wanted to spend more time with Timothy, especially because he spelled his surname appropriately. That's the way Grandma spelled it. I'm going to skip ahead though. There was a couple questions that had to do. I'm kind of generalizing about this question about Timothy Hepner's views and your own views. See, when you're writing satire, it's easy to say that I'm just being a stinker, like, oh, look at
Yeah.
me. But when you're writing about someone, you're attempting to write a character earnestly and honestly. The question then is, how much do you find yourself going into this character? Dave Rogalski wrote, how much are Timothy Hepner's views of Mennonite heritage also yours?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say uh, not entirely, but a significant amount. It seems like, when I started the Daily Bonnet, some people, at least at the beginning, thought I was kind of mocking and, that sort of thing. When I view it as a celebration, and there's critique for sure. But over the course of writing the Daily Bonnet, I've kind of become more interested in my own family history, the history of Southern Manitoba. I always had an interest in that, but more so in the last few years. And my wife and I go around to, visit all these historical sites. So it's definitely that interest in local history. I think a lot of times people think that the only stories worth telling or the only history worth knowing is somebody else's, some grand narratives from some other place, and those are the only stories worth telling. And that's wrong. So that part, I definitely agree with, with the Timothy character in that sense. There's not everything. He's more of he's more passive than I am. He's more of I think Erman Weeb called him the quintessential non-resistant Mennonite. I'm not quite as, I could get into an argument with people easier than this character can. So he's not, it's not autobiographical in that sense, but sure. Yeah, I definitely share that interest in history that he has, or the other characters do too. Yeah.
You mentioned your interest in history, and this is apparent from the videos that you're making and posting on YouTube, where you're walking
Yeah.
through some places in southern Manitoba. You missed out on my hometown, but I'm not going to blame you, because there is nothing older than 50 years old standing in Winkler. They just level that stuff, which is the theme in your novel.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, like, if you can walk us through some of your research process. We talked about your literary influences before, but I'm wondering about your actual practical experiences. Um, you walk the ground that you're writing about, but you're not writing about an actual place. Edenfield exists only in your mind. So
Yeah.
how do you combine your historical interest with the place in which this novel was located?
Yeah. I think if you, I don't think I ever set out, like, when I'm visiting these historic places or non-historic places or places where things used to be, in southern Manitoba. I don't know if I ever visited any of them consciously thinking this should go on my novel. I don't know if I was ever doing that, but inevitably those things do come into the novel. And I think the history that's mentioned in the book, some of that I knew already, and some of it I researched, or I would realize I had an error here, and some of it is deliberately wrong. It's fiction, right? So it's not intended to be an accurate history of anything, but it should at least be believable or consistent or whatever. So yeah, I mean, I've read a lot of local history books, and I should show it. The authors of this book would like it if I would show it, but I don't have it in front of me. But the Historic Atlas of the East Reserve, excellent book about all these places around this area that are no longer here. So that book alone was a really inspirational for just getting me interested in exploring the history around this area. So if that constitutes research, then that's definitely part of it for sure.
It's all research,
everything.
It's all research, but I'm just like, it wasn't a formal practice that you're undergoing. And that's interesting because the main character in your story also doesn't undergo any formal study of history. Like, I felt I was microdosing Mennonite history while I was reading your novel, but I felt as though I was doing it with a friend, so it was perfectly safe and everything was okay.
Yeah.
We're going to move on because there's a couple other questions about Mennonite culture I'd like for you to address. One of them has to do with how about this? There is a shocking lack of religion in the novel. I mean, you just read about the catechism class, which I thoroughly enjoyed, but there is, instead of religion, instead of focusing on the Mennonite religion, you focus on the Mennonite culture, which makes sense because it reflects the tension that the characters are feeling. They don't want to give up Wi-Fi, but they also don't want to give up Metaschlope and FASPA. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
They want to kind of negotiate the world as it is now with the way that they understand it in the past, between being progressive and also preservative, I guess. So why did you choose that? Because I'm expecting when I sit down with the Mennonite novel that I'm going to spend some time in church. There wasn't very much church going on here.
Yeah, there is a foot washing scene. You're right. I think that the themes of religion have been explored by a lot of other authors, including Mennonite writers, and maybe I felt I could write about something a little different than what has been explored by some of our other known novelists who've written about that topic and done so very well. So of course you can't avoid religion when you're talking about southern Manitoba, but at the same time, I felt maybe in the realm of novels and books that are out there, maybe this was a topic that was had received maybe less attention, and just that idea that the religion has changed so much, and the way people practice church has changed so much, and the culture has changed so much, and Mennonites religiously, culturally, in every way have become assimilated, at least in Manitoba, well, almost completely. And I'm one of those, right? I'm completely assimilated. But what have we lost in that process? I think a lot of, there have been a lot of books written that kind of say that have criticized, the Mennonite Church and so on, and rightfully so for a lot of times. But I guess my question is, what's been lost? And so I was trying to look at that. Yeah.
Actually, on that note, this is kind of a lightning round question. Do you speak Plotich?
No. So I mean, I know a lot of words, and I have Jack Thiessen's dictionary. And if someone speaks very slow, I can usually understand what they're saying in context. But no, in that sense, I'm exactly, like the assimilated Mennonite that's lost.
I don't mean any shade. I am not throwing anything. I also don't speak Plotich in any meaningful way. And I found that writing was a way to learn about the culture, and I couldn't avoid. Do you feel like you've lost something by not speaking our mother tongue?
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Everybody has some mother tongue of some sort, or ancestral tongue of some sort, right? And I think not just me, but society in general, Canada in general, you know, or North America or whatever, loses something when everybody speaks English, and that's it. And it happens, that's not just a Mennonite thing, that happens with many different groups.
Yeah. And part of the problem that I have with this, since I don't speak Plotich, but I have the dictionary. I have two dictionaries. I have the revised and updated version, which is no way to learn.
The Revised Standard Version?
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's no way to learn a spoken language like Plotich, a dialect, by reading it in the pages. I'm not sure why I thought that was the way to do it.
Yeah.
But I certainly feel as though I've kind of betrayed my ancestors, since so much of the culture rests on the tongue, and I don't know how to speak it. On that note, a question came in just a second ago that I'd really like to ask you. It's from Mary Lou Drieger about the role of Mennonite food in Once Removed. I don't speak the language,
Yeah.
but I eat the food. Every time one of your ghostwriting clients breaks their contract with you, food is involved. Bread also plays a big role. Was that deliberate? And how do you see the role of Mennonite food in the novel?
Well, definitely food, no matter what group of people you're talking about, food is like an essential part of an identity, and it unites people. And it's like one of the least controversial things out there. I mean, look at how many YouTube channels and TV shows there are about there, and how people cross cultures through food, and, you know, break down barriers through food. So yes, it was deliberate to include food, but I liked to use it, kind of go against that. It's used in the book as a unifying factor, as a cultural identity kind of thing, but also the weaponization of food, I guess. It's also used as a divisive thing. So it kind of has both of those elements in the book.
Yeah, I can't stand farmer sausage, and literally every time somebody wants to talk to me about food from my hometown, they're like, "Have you tried the Winkler sausage?" And I'm like, "I am. This is what Winkler sausage looks like." Okay, moving on. There's a question, and it's by a Dueck. It's by Dora Dueck, and she knows about writing. The question is simply this: how long did it take you to write the novel?
Yeah, well, that depends when you define that I started it. Because I did have some sort of a novel 6 or 7 years ago, you know, even before I started the Daily Bonnet, that evolved into this finished product. But it's, you know, so you could say 6 or 7 years, but it's so different than the finished product that I would almost say, you know, it bears very little resemblance to the finished product. So the answer is 7 years, or let's say since I started, you know, working at it more recently and with Turnstone and stuff, maybe 2 years of turning it into something much better.
That's the process. That makes perfect sense to me. We're up to lightning round questions now, so I'm going to fire some at you and see how you do. Number one, where are all the MCCs in the novel? What you got against MCC? Don't like the Mennonite Central Committee?
Don't I mention, doesn't the thrift store get mentioned in there?
Yeah.
Okay.
I want to know about bag sales. I want to know about, anyway.
Yeah. Actually, I shouldn't say. Never mind. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, next.
Okay, so take that. Number two, where are all the Ungers in a novel? I can chart the Mennonite names, but you left out your own?
I know. I used like every single Mennonite name, but you can't throw an Unger if the writer's an Unger, can you? Can you do that?
100%.
Oh, okay.
In fact,
Well,
I changed some of the last names in my own copy to Unger just because I thought it felt better. Like, I don't want to throw any shade on the Klippensteins, but no thanks. Next up. There's a question here about whether you eat Varenica or pierogies.
I usually say Varenica, but that's like more recently when I've tried to, like, you know, say it correctly. I've sort of retrained myself to say it correctly.
I think that might actually be a Yanti Ditsit issue, because we call it Varenica on my side.
Oh, okay.
Yours is Varenica, which is just weird. I wouldn't put that in my mouth. No, thank you. What's the difference between pacifism and being passive aggressive?
Well, there is a big difference between those two things, but I suppose sometimes some people who are pacifists, their outlet might be passive aggression because they can't be violent.
Exactly.
But yeah,
That's
so
the sort of thing. When you're sending a prayer request, you just mention everyone's wrongs as though you're concerned about them becoming better.
Well, in the book it says that they in the one of the few church scenes it mentions that you're always supposed to ask for prayer when really what you want is money. What you need is money.
That's a good place to end. I'm going to call on John Taves, and I'm going to say thank you to the Holy Ghost writer, Andrew Unger. I mentioned earlier, this was the only novel that I was able to read during our time with COVID. And I'm also not able to go home to my ancestral homeland where you are presently found. And so it was really great to read a novel that felt like home. I don't have the Mennonite soil between my toes. I'm not strolling the sales aisles of McNally Robinson, but I'm grateful, and I've been holding on to Once Removed because that's as good as home to me right now.
Wow. Thank you.
Thank you. John?
And thank you both. I will remind you that if you wish to answer Andrew's prayers for book sales tonight, you may conveniently purchase books through McNally Robinson Booksellers, either online, over the phone, or in person. Andrew signed many copies for us here at the Winnipeg store, and our Saskatoon store will have signed copies as well shortly. We also mail out books if anyone is interested. This event was streaming via YouTube, and a recording will remain if you'd like to revisit the conversation or pass the link along to someone who was unable to attend. So much gratitude to Turnstone Press for bringing this novel into the world and this event to fruition. I'd also like to thank Andrew Unger for his fine writing, engaging responses, and from a purely sartorial perspective, for ensuring that we all didn't get too giddy tonight by repping Neil Young's most depressing novel on his shirt. And to Nathan Dueck, of course, for holding Andrew's feet to the fire while hosting with aplomb. Thanks also to all of you lovely attendees for joining us three bearded Mennonites this evening. I'd also like to apologize to those viewers upset that this did not turn into an all-out crokinole or a nip splat tournament, but I do hope you have a wonderful night regardless. Thank you all so very much.
Peace.
Thanks.